thank you everybody for attending virtually today, and also for those in person, thank you for coming out. Hopefully we can get back to these all in person sooner rather than later. But today I have the great honor of introducing former Governor Bob McDonnell to come speak to us today for our first Speakers Luncheon of 2021. I could go probably the entire hour just going through his resume and many accomplishments, but with the help of his assistant Michelle, who's here with us today, we've pared it down to a few highlights. Governor McDonnell has been in public service for 38 years as a military officer, prosecutor, legislator, attorney general, and governor. He's run his own company for 6 years. He teaches law at Regent University and Liberty University and appears as a guest on Newsmax TV. He also serves on some business and charitable boards. He is going to talk to us today about the topic of political civility, which is certainly a good topic to talk about at this time. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Governor Bob McDonnell.
Well, thank you, John, and thanks for those of you joining us by the miracle of Zoom, I think it is, or Microsoft Teams, Zoom. And welcome. I hope you've had a virtual lunch. And for those of you that have showed up, thanks for being here. I will attest that everybody was properly masked and social distanced, both for the greeting and for lunch. And even Mr. Washington and Mr. Jefferson are appropriately masked. So we'll not be getting any age-old viruses from them as well. But it's nice to be here. Got to tell you something about your president, though. I just got to meet him here a little bit, but he's a little bit of crafty. And now that I knew he's a lawyer, that kind of explains it all. Me being a lawyer myself, I know how they are. But he called me up, didn't know him, said Governor McDonnell, you believe in the First Amendment, don't you? I said, well, of course. He said, well, then you believe in free speech. And I said, of course. He goes, well, good, because I need you to come down and give one to the Virginia Club, a nice free speech for us. So here I am today. And, you know, you don't get asked to speak as much when you're a former governor. I've been out now almost 7 years to the day since I left office. The great privilege of my life to serve as in the same job as Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, you know, for just average middle-class kid from Fairfax County. It doesn't get any better than that to have that opportunity. And, you know, everywhere you go, you get driven by the state police. So you get very humbled when your term is over, just like, you know, when people don't need you anymore, the phone stops ringing. It's a kind of a wake-up experience. So they literally, the state police get you to your home of record. They drop you off there, say goodbye, and you never see them again. I mean, that's the end of it. It's not like the Secret Service for the president who continues in perpetuity. So there's an old joke among governors is, how do you know when you're no longer governor? Well, it's when you get in the back of a black SUV and it doesn't go anywhere. That's how you know. So anyway, I've learned the lesson, but thank you for having me down here to speak, because first and foremost, I think this issue of civility and its twin attribute of humility are things not only critically lacking in our body politic today, but more importantly, I think are vitally important for the future of the republic. You look at why some of the great civilizations over time, Rome, Greece, others, they never thought they were going anywhere, just like we don't after 240 years of the American experiment. But among the attributes that bring civilizations down are really the lack of values and the lack of civility. You know, America's the kind of country, we are economically and militarily strong enough to take on and defeat any enemy. But we're not strong enough in this day and age where we can't defeat ourselves from within. And that's the way most great civilizations collapse. So this is a critically important topic, and especially in light of some of the things during the course of the presidential campaign and in the aftermath that have now been, you know, glued in everybody's mind. The images we see on TV of acts on the street where civility is turned into violence is something that's really critically important to address. Most of you look like you're old enough. I can't see all of you on Zoom. Some of you have your screen off, but what I can tell you is I bet most of you remember the good old days where Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, different parties, one the speaker, one the president, one Republican, one Democrat. They had differences of opinion, but they would find ways to talk about what they needed to do about night. Reagan and O'Neill would have a beer at night and they'd come out and they'd have a deal. There'd be some agreement that they would be able to work out. And even 20 plus years ago with Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, despite the impeachment there in the middle, when you look at the second half of Clinton's term, they actually reformed welfare. It's the last time we actually had a balanced budget. The economy was humming until the dot-com bust, but they found ways to actually govern and work together despite being of different political parties. And you look, it's just the last couple of the reigns of the last couple presidents, and it has been a very, very different feel. And I think there's, when you're out of office, you have even more liberty to speak frankly. I'm not running for anything. I don't need any votes, so I'm at complete liberty to tell you the way McDonnell sees it here. So I hope you'll allow me the freedom and to be able to do that, because I've thought about this long and hard for many years about why this attribute of sticking to your guns, not compromising on your principles, but find ways to get things done, to govern, to get results for people, and do it without looking at your opponent as your enemy. I mean, many of the greats in America have said that. Your fellow American who's on the opposite side of the political aisle or the opposite side of the business table or the negotiating table, if you're a lawyer, they're not your enemies. They're just your opponent in this particular matter. And so many of the things about opposition in America used to be, we have some common ideas or goals for the country, but we have very different pathways about the role of government to get those done. I mean, that used to be the difference. And I think part of the problem today is we have probably the biggest gulf that I've ever seen in my 40 years or so following this between the core political philosophies of the respective political parties. And therefore, it leads to this fidelity to party over fidelity to the people and the country, that the chasm is so wide. So I want to talk about a couple things that I think you'll find interesting, or at least thought-provoking, about what the scope of the problem is, why we have the problem, then honestly, what you can do about it. And what you all on the Zoom conference, what you all can do about it, because each of us have a role, I think, in the body politic. It's the citizens that drive the government. I know you sometimes think it's the other way around, but that's the essence of our democracy. We get the kind of government that we choose and that we select and that we deserve. And so the character of the people should inform the elected officials and not the other way around. I want to read you, so I was talking about Washington, and John, I promise you, Washington is my role model for the citizen statesman. I grew up on land owned by Washington right near Mount Vernon. My mom worked there. My mom was on the board. My dad was on the board of Mount Vernon. And so I've become a little bit of a student of Washington, mainly because perhaps no one has sacrificed more for their country before they became president. He was the first president. He helped to define the presidency. And at that time, of course, we had no term limits, and he willingly walked away from power knowing that there's a time to do that, because he had just fought against King George. He realized that what happens with the excesses and abuses of power, and he felt that it was the right thing to do to leave. So how many of you have read George Washington's Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior? Very good. How many of you even heard of it? Hands on Zoom. How old was George Washington when he wrote those rules? 16 years old. Washington knew more about civility and decent behavior than most members of Congress today at age 16. Different time, different era. Let me just give you a couple of George Washington's pithy rules. Rule number 1, every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. Rule 22, show not yourself glad at the misfortune of another, though he were your enemy. Doesn't sound like Washington today. Washington, D.C. He would shudder that his namesake city is behaving the way they do. I think. Rule 34 is good manners to prefer them to whom we speak before ourselves, especially if they be above us, with whom in no sort we ought to begin. Rule 35, let your discourse with men of business be short and comprehensive. And that's what I'm going to try to do today, although it'll probably be more comprehensive than short, because that's not my gift, is being short. So that's George Washington to give us a little bit of a set. I encourage all of you to read that. They're short, pithy, they're etched in the culture of the time, but yet there are points that are of such great merit that I think it would have all of you be of interest. It's a very short read. So I'm going to talk about this issue of civility and its attendant gift of humility in a way that I hope will be helpful, because we now live in a horrific, hyper-partisan, vitriolic, 24-hour-a-day news cycle where the gap between the philosophies of the party is so great, and this zest, almost a lust to maintain power, seems to be more important than anything else. There are a lot of things that undermine a human being. In the past, I think the great problems in Washington have either been money, sex, or something else. Today, I think it's this absolute zest for power that is at the root of why we have such incivility. Let me read to you what the founder said about political parties. And I am a Republican. I'm happy to be a Republican. That's where I think the proper principles and philosophies that have helped America be successful lie. But we ought to realize that people have different views. There's been great Republican and Democratic presidents of the country, and there have been some lousy ones too. And so it's more the character of the person and the ideas and whether they work, whether they edify the people, whether they maximize the prosperity and the opportunity for people that really matter. But our founders were extraordinarily negative about political parties, and then they joined them. So they're part of the problem. But let me just read to you what they said about political parties. George Washington, 1796. This is his last year as president. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. The spirit of party serves to always distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, and kindles animosity of one part against another. John Adams. There is nothing which I dread so much as the division of the Republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other. This, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution. Hamilton. Nothing could be more ill-judged than the intolerant spirit which has at all times characterized political parties. And I can go on and on reading them, but I think you get the gist of the clarion warnings from 220 years ago of our founders. Washington was the only independent president. There were no political parties. And then of course, we had the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, and it's devolved into the two major political parties today. But when you start to put your faith and trust and beliefs in a party so that you put party over people and power over principle, what you get is kind of what we have now today in America, where one party is, we're 100% right, you're 100% wrong, your principles are evil, and we will use litigation, legislation, whatever, impeachment to try to destroy you, and we don't care about the collateral damage. It's a very different way of doing things. It's certainly not the kind of rhetoric you heard from a John Kennedy. or a Ronald Reagan back in those days. Both people that really were really focused, I think, on the good of the nation. So that's a little bit of the background. So why do we have that? I think there's a series of things that have happened over the last 20, 25 years that have really changed the dynamic. I think the first Gulf War, was one where there was general unanimity about a direction of a country and what we did there. But I think starting with the impeachment of Bill Clinton, which Republicans said was necessary, the Democrats said was not sufficient to justify an impeachment, was probably the first thing. Then we had Bush v. Gore. And then we had the election of our first African-American president. And let's face it, there were a lot of people that were opposed to him solely because of his race. And their incivility followed that. We had, of course, the mortgage-backed security crisis of 2008, 2009. There was deep division about what to do and blame assigned to one party or the other. And then, of course, this past election, the election of 2016, and this past election, I think some of the rhetoric was very, very unfortunate and unflattering. As much as I admire so many things that President Trump did, his style and a spirit of almost bullying and incivility was not helpful to the country. It's hard to unify people around principles when you're belittling anybody that doesn't agree with you. And so I've tried to be honest with Democrats and Republicans when it comes to a style of governing, which ought to be stick to your principles, but bring people together to solve problems. Most people in America, regardless of party, they're not so much concerned about whether Democrats or Republicans win. They just want a type of government that does what the Constitution says, spends money wisely, fixes problems, and then stay out of the way so they can pursue the American dream for themselves and their family. And so we're just in a different age now. And as we see, words have consequences. If you speak certain words that seem to promote or tolerate violence, you get a lot of what we saw for the last 6 months of last year, where every major city in the country had violence as used as a political weapon to make political and civility justice statement. If you make certain comments at a rally to your supporters, then you can get people that take those words seriously and do what happened on January 6th. So, my point is words really mean things, and leaders need to take account of what they say and how they can either escalate or cool down the temperature of debate. So why do we have this today? I mentioned some of the dynamics of the last 20 years, but we've now got 24-hour social media. Everybody's a reporter. When I grew up, I grew up in Northern Virginia. It was the Washington Post and 3 TV stations. When we got UHF, that was incredible. The number of stations went up by 33%. Some of you are old enough to remember when that happened. But now everybody's a reporter. There are blogs, there's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's all kinds of media, and everybody feels like they're free to say their opinion, whether they're defaming or libeling somebody. They're able to have their voice, and it's 24 hours a day. From 3 TV stations, we've got, I think Mike Cable's TV station goes up to maybe 1,200. There's so many different opportunities, and everybody's competing for the pithy headline, for the news. Everybody wants to go on and be able to give their opinion, and the more shrill you are, the more you get quoted, the more you're famous, the more you get invited back. There's like almost a media cultural fascination with those people that seem to be the most divisive or the most pithy, that get the most the airtime. And so I think the media, by what they prefer, deserves a little bit of the blame. The media used to be all pretty much hard news. We report, you decide. That doesn't seem to be the way it is anymore. Almost every media, whether it's Fox, Newsmax on the right, I do a lot of stuff on Newsmax, or CNN, MSNBC, or one of these other stations on the left. The news is almost always coded with opinion. You can't tell the facts from the opinion in reporting anymore. So you're not just getting the facts and you decide. I mean, you're getting the facts according to the way it's being spun. And the same thing even with our social media. You see just recently, Trump's banned on Twitter for life. Mike Lindell, who is the CEO of MyPillow, said his piece about what he thought a couple of weeks ago. He's now banned. And so we now have the private sector doing their share of the censorship. And it's, of course, through what they think is right, fair, etc. So Jack Dorsey may have one view, and the people at Apple and Google may have a different view. But we're now in this really toxic sort of cancel culture. If you disagree with me, I'm going to do everything I can to basically, wipe you out from social media presence. That's kind of where we live. I didn't even hear the term cancel culture. I didn't know what it was until about 6 months ago. My pastor explained it to me, and I was shocked that people, really do that. But I do think that the social media bears some responsibility for that. So what are the solutions? Because that's really what I want. I've kind of staged for you the problem. And I think there's a series of things. I think every citizen has a duty to find ways when they're evaluating who they want to represent them at the state, federal, local levels, elect people that are going to be statesmen, that and you can discern are going to do what's rise above the spirit of party that our founders talked about, and try to do what they really believe will work and what is right for the nation. We were talking here about with John about some of the early people that I served with back in the 90s. There were Democrats right here from the city of Norfolk, Tom Moss and George Heilig and Taylor Murphy and other people like that. Alan Diamondstein, they were they were gentlemen. They helped me. I was a young Republican. They were senior Democrats. But we didn't have that. We didn't have that animosity of trying to destroy, belittle the opponent at all times. You had people that actually found ways to work together. You need to raise up people like that, and that's who you put forth, especially if they're from the business community, the legal community, people Raise up people like that and encourage them to get involved in public service, because public service is tough. It is not easy to put your family, your reputation, your name on the line. All of you know what I went through when I left office with a 3.5-year, $28 million fight with the federal government, leading to a unanimous Supreme Court decision. It is contact politics. So you want people of character and substance who will be civil to be able to be in office. Secondly, one thing that sort of troubles me is sort of the decline in moral values seems to be very much commensurate with the decline of the number of people in America today. They say that they believe in God and they go to church. It's about a 15% decline over the last 15 years, according to Gallup. And to me, those two things sort of go hand in hand. So many people, especially at the foundations of our country, and look, our founders had plenty of warts. No, there's hadn't been a perfect man walk this earth in 2,000 years. But what I do know is that they understood that some of these traditional Judeo-Christian values upon which our country, I think, inarguably was founded, that they knew that that's the way you try to govern, both in policy and the way you deal with other people. And I think as that reliance on traditional values and faith has declined, so has the degree of civility. I find it interesting that all three of the great Abrahamic faiths, Christianity and Judaism and Islam, all have something that's akin to the Golden Rule. Those of you that might be like me, that might be people of the Christian faith, remember the admonitions of Jesus in Matthew 18 and Matthew 20. And it's all about humility and servant leadership and respect for others, cardinal virtues that have made this a great country. Jesus said, unless you humble yourself and become like this little child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And then in Matthew 20, he says that The Son of Man came not to serve, not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And these are principles of faith that all three of the world's great religions have. And so if we have less reliance on that, then we have fewer people, I think, that embody that tradition and then live it out, whether it's in business or law or the arts or government. And I think that begins to me, is part of the challenge. And it's not just the faith tradition, but it's also been well archived and chronicled in business literature. How many of you read the book Good to Great by Jim Collins? Jim Collins is a management guru, probably 30 years, written a number of books, Good to Great, Built to Last. If you haven't done it, read Good to Great, but I'll tell you the upshot of the entire book is he examined over a period of about 10 years the 1,500 of the greatest companies in America and looked at their leaders to try to determine what was the X factor, what was the core governing philosophy of those business leaders that always led those companies to 2 or 3x above their competitors in stock performance, better retention among employees, better innovation, etc. And he found after all that the cardinal trait was humility. You wouldn't think that necessarily. You don't get taught that necessarily in management schools today in the universities of America, but it was humility. People aggressive and energetic, but not for their own adulation, but for the good of the company. And that's how they led, and that's why they were successful. So again, these virtues of humility and civility go hand in hand. And you just see so little of that. It just seems like in the political leaders or the media leaders today, in the way they conduct themselves. And so, to be honest, it's a kind of a poor example for the rest of people that accept that as the role or the way that projects strength or good leadership. The other thing that I think we may need to consider is in government is to look at term limits and a change in the way we redistrict. I was terribly opposed to term limits for most of my time in government because it's really a capitulation that the public is not educated enough to discern the good leaders from the bad leaders, essentially, because you should be able to be free to rehire the good ones and throw the ones out that you don't like or that are bad. But we have so much incumbency now where there's really, because of the privileges of the franking privilege and money and the PACs being involved, primarily supporting incumbents, that we generally have a lot more of the status quo than we do change. In fact, a lot of people get thrown out because of their own political primaries, and that's because of redistricting. We have about 2/3 of the seats in Congress that are no longer fully competitive. There's a distinct advantage for one party or the other, and so what that does is that encourages strict fidelity to party and rhetoric, and you don't dare compromise or vote for the other side, because if you go home, you're going to get primaried by your own party and you risk losing your seat. So you've got that factor that is constantly weighing on an elected official's mind is, I've got to be strident enough so I'm appealing to my base. And in only about maybe 1/3 of the districts are they sort of purple enough or competitive enough where you don't worry about those issues as much. So those are just a few thoughts, and I would say to all of you members here of the Virginia Club, you've been at this for 148 years. It all started as a social club to bring in goodwill and good fellowship right here in the city of Norfolk and beyond. It was a group of Virginia gentlemen who I assume embrace those issues of civility, and so I would say to you that each one of you can make a difference. The fact that you're a member of a club like this tells me you're an opinion leader and you care enough about your community to regularly get together and talk about these important issues of the day. So I just encourage you to be golden rule people. We used to talk about that a lot. Now it seems like it's morphed into he who has the gold rules. Well, that's not the golden rule. It's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And again, most of the world's great religions have that as one of their tenets, but you can do that. You can treat other people with respect. You can be forceful in not tolerating people that don't treat people with respect. You can demand that in the culture of your organization, your law firm, your business, whatever the case may be, so that that becomes the new way of people dealing. I was really encouraged that President Biden, that was the first thing he said to his staff the afternoon of his inauguration. He got them all together and he said, the surest way for any one of you to get fired is not to treat each other and the public with respect. I thought that was just terrific. Now the test is, will he live it out? And will he really do that? Or will he become part of this intense hyper-partisan problem where only Democrats are good and Republicans are evil? And it's been the other way too, of course, when Republicans have been in charge. So those are just a few thoughts about, I think, what the problem is, what we can do about it. But I see this really as truly one of, and I'll close on this, really one of the existential problems that face this country. It's this humility and civility gap, getting more people with a servant leader, humble and civil approach to government. That doesn't mean being a milquetoast. George Bush had a very famous debate with some reporters about why he was civil. Did that mean weakness? And he had a beautiful response. You can Google it and found it. This is Bush 41 about why he embraced civility. He was no milquetoast. You saw his reaction, after in the first Gulf War. But he said, you don't confuse civility with weakness. They're two completely different characteristics. So, but each of you can be a model and a projection of that value that really begins to change the culture in the sphere around you. So I'm going to pause, John. I think you want to leave just a few minutes for questions. I know I've talked a little longer than I was allotted, but I hope that gave you something to think about. And I just encourage you to say that, this is the most unprecedented time we've had in 102 years since the end of the First World War and the Spanish flu pandemic. There's no playbook among anybody in government to open it up and say, this is what you do. So I cut a lot of slack to the people that are presidents, governors, mayors. It's not easy, and where even the scientists don't have all the answers. So we've got to find ways to work together, especially along the lines of race. By 2046, this will be a majority non-white nation. 2046. We may not see it, but some of us may not see it, but our kids will. And I hope we hand off to them a better, kinder, gentler society where we embrace that vision of Martin Luther King, that we'll be judged on the content of our character, not the color of our skin. And we can go a long way towards that by this issue of civility to people, regardless of race, creed, color, etc. So, thank you.
Thank you, Governor. I'm going to check the Zoom, and if you'll repeat the questions so everybody can hear it.
For Zoom? Okay. Yes, sir.
I have a question. And campaign managers say that they have to do it because it works. Both sides do it, and it really only works for the time. Do you have any suggestions about how to end that up, given the first Amendment problem? They seem to be getting worse as time.
Do you want me to repeat that for the people on Zoom, or everybody can hear that? Or just the Zoom people to repeat it for the audience?
I think just the Zoom people.
Okay, all right. So that's a great question. How do we clean up the attack ads? And every political consultant that I've had says you got to do it because it works. Same thing you said. That people hate it, but they believe it. That's the problem with anything you repeat often enough seems to have a ring of the truth. I tried, and I don't know if you remember my campaign for 2009, but I had one bumper sticker, Bob's for Jobs. All I wanted to talk about, how was I going to create jobs? Everything we did, whether it was roads, schools, every road led to jobs. I happen to have a great name that rhymed with jobs, and that happened to be the #1 issue in the campaign. So I figured that's what I needed to do. So I try to keep everything positive. I do contrast with my opponents on some things? Yes, but I try to do it in a way that was respectful. And I just think back to find people to run who have that same attitude. What we've tried to do over the years is we've had more disclaimers, like a stand by your ad law, where the candidate actually has to go on at the end with a disclaimer, or if it's TV, sometimes have his face there saying, I approve this ad. No, I take ownership for that. So you couldn't blame it on a PAC. You couldn't blame it on your campaign manager. you personally own it. And so if your name is behind it, hopefully that would cut down on the rhetoric. But again, so much of this is consultant and poll driven. The polls show these are your top 3 hits against your opponent. Go run an ad on every one of those and spend $1 million an ad. I mean, that's sort of the advice I got as governor, but you got to realize you got to find candidates that will own their campaign. Every candidate that I consult or talk to or mentor, give free advice, it's your campaign, it's your name, it's not your consultants. Many of them are in it to win, but also for the money. You make those choices. I mean, that's the kind of people that I think we need. Other than that, with First Amendment protections, there's not a lot of hedge against it, especially if you're saying something against an elected official. You remember the New York Times v. Sullivan case, where you can say almost anything you want against a public figure or a public official, unless there's involved actual malice. In other words, it's a lot higher standard than it is against just a neighbor or fellow business guy. You have a lot more license to say what you want. And most people couch it in terms of an opinion as opposed to a fact. And so unless you're accusing an elected official of a crime, generally it's not actionable. And so again, I think it's got to be, this is a bottom up. It's not going to be a legal system down fix to the problem.
I'll remind those on Zoom that you have a question, just unmute yourself and make yourself known and answer that.
Yes, sir.
My memory as a kid, most of our legislative governmental leaders were lawyers. 80%, 90%.
Yeah.
That was the way of passage.
Yes. That's gone way down, by the way, now. But that.
Learn to argue,
Yeah.
learn to be effective. And we talk about term limits. You have just people who are business people or general citizens or other good people. But in your opinion, do we lose some of our effectiveness when we just have some regular Joe who's a great person, very humble, very nice, and so forth, but is not prepared themselves to be effective in convincing people of things that need to change or things that need to stay the same?
Yeah. Well, that's.
Remember popped up there.
Yeah, the question is, are we better off or worse off without too many lawyers in the legislature? That's de facto. When I was elected to the House of Delegates in 1991 as a lawyer, I think we're at about almost 60% of the body was made up of lawyers. I don't know the number today, but I suspect it's 30% or under. When I was chairman of the Courts of Justice Committee in the House, we actually had problems finding enough lawyers to staff that committee. In fact, we put our first non-lawyers on that committee because there weren't enough. So it's really changed. And I think, I'm not going to be presumptuous enough by any means to say, first of all, the people ought to have the choice. Do they want a lawyer, or do they want a ballerina, or do they want whomever from whatever profession? Because the whole idea of the citizen legislator is you take the normal, everyday person to represent, in the case of the House, 87,000 people, the state Senate, maybe 150,000 people. You take that number of people, and they carry your voice to Washington or to Richmond. You don't need a lawyer necessarily to do that. Yes, they may have better debate or arguing skills. Yes, they are more versed in the law as it is. Yes, they go to court and do things where they might have better insights on how the law ought to change to be more effective or work better or more fair. So it does give a lawyer an advantage. But in terms of being a good servant leader to represent other people, I think that's profession agnostic. I think anybody with a willing heart can do that, as long as you're willing to take unfair shots and go beg for money and things like that. I think it's wide open, and that's the beauty of democracy. The people have a choice. But I will say again, I don't know there's a correlation, but it seems over the years, we used to have something called the Virginia Way. It's been talked about ever since I've been aligned with politics, probably goes back to the 1950s, where there is a sense of civility. Now, when that term was invented, the Democratic Party was the majority party going on 130 years. So I don't, you know, they were trying to have civility just among the one party, which is an interesting way. We were talking earlier, the debates used to be in the Virginia legislature more between urban, suburban, and rural legislators as opposed to Republican, Democrat, although those can be very intense battles as well. Now they're more between party. A lot of the major issues are party line or close to party line votes in Washington and in Richmond. And I think the toxic level of debate, even since I've left office 7 years ago, it seems to me to have escalated pretty dramatically. At the same time, the number of lawyers in the legislature have gone down. Like I said, I don't think they're necessarily related, but lawyers do have, and I will say, John, you would probably agree, lawyers are trained to argue a case without taking it personally, because you still deal with that same lawyer on the other side, maybe, you know, 10 more times that year in other cases, and the things may be different, or you may have a case with that other lawyer. So you learn to not take every argument personally. When you do, that's what gives you the depth of the animus sometimes, where you're willing to say things that are beyond the pale about not just the other policy position, but about the other person, and that's when it really gets bad. Anyway, that was probably too much. Other questions? Yeah, John was saying, talking about the new redistricting legislation that passed this year. I mentioned that as one of the causes, I think, it's certainly at the federal level, of incivility, when you have 2/3 of the Congress that's more concerned about their base, their party base, than they are about the electorate because of the nature of the redistricting. And both parties have done it. You know, to the victor belongs the spoils, was the old saying, meaning whatever you can carve it up. The problem right now is with technology, redistricting software is so precise. It's like, you know, putting the laser guided bomb down Saddam Hussein's chimney. I mean, you can carve right around a legislator's district and, you know, have just the right mix if you want to divide it up by either political party or race or religion. I mean, you got all this data. And I mean, I know when Republicans drew the lines back in 2010, they carved 3 or 4 Democrats into one district. So only one of them could run, and then we had open seats in the other ones. I actually vetoed the first redistricting bill of my Republican friends. They were furious with me, but I thought it was unconstitutional, so that's what I did. But the point is, this new system is designed to try to fix that with having 8 legislators and 8 citizens. If you've been following the news, they've been now appointed, and there's I think 4 judges that are also appointed, and some of them are clear partisans, and some of them are because they're elected officials, and others are appointed by the partisans, arguably with the goal of them checking their opinions at the door and just trying to do things that are fair and right and actually draw lines according to the constitutional requirements of being contiguous and compact, as opposed to gerrymandered in order to fit a political objective. So I think there's hope. We'll see. I mean, they just started to work. This is the redistricting year, because last year, that's always the year after the census that you do the redistricting. Last year we did the redistricting bill that I finally signed was litigated for 9 years after that. So, I mean, they were running in different districts. It was a mess. I think this holds some hope. If those citizen legislators really take, citizens, I mean, they were appointed, take their job seriously, it almost doesn't matter what the partisan electeds do, because they'll have the majority and they can actually draw lines that are fair and competitive, so that it's the marketplace of ideas, it's the policies of the candidates that determine not just the party affiliation. If you're in a 60% Republican district, you're going to probably win. So I think it's a good thing. I think it's worth a try. If it turns out in a year or two to break down to a partisan mess, I think they'll retool it and try again, because it really needs to be done. Otherwise, the spirit of party will be what reigns, and that's, as I read, that's not good. Yes, sir.
Of those announced candidates and any you think will pop up, who might be your top 2 to 4 projected next governors of Virginia, governor of
I think on the Republican side, Speaker Kirk Cox is probably the leader. Now I've endorsed him, but I think he's as fine a person as I've ever met in government. Career school teacher, 30 years. Hadn't been in it at all for the money. Hadn't made money. As a teacher and a legislator, you just $17,000 a year is what the House of Delegates members make. Just so you know, it's not, at least at the state level, you don't go into it for any financial gain. But he's just a very good, even keel, reasonable guy. I think when he was speaker, people on both sides would say he was fair. I think Terry McAuliffe is probably the lead on the other side. He's running against two African-American women, but Terry's got a lot of support in the Black community too. I think he'll, his problem is whether he's almost too moderate for the modern Democratic Party. I think just giving my honest assessment as to where the energy is in the Democratic Party seems to be much more with the progressive wing. You saw that play out in the last year up in Washington. But I still think he's a favorite. He's far outraised any other candidate, Republican or Democrat. So I would expect to see a Terry McAuliffe, Kirk Cox battle. They know each other. Terry was governor while Kirk was speaker. I mean, they know each other. And I think that I think it'll be a real policy-driven campaign. Of course, there'll be the usual campaign consultant-driven ads and so forth. But they both know state government well, and I think that's really good for the people. Whoever's the next governor will be well experienced with a good policy record and a good understanding of policy. Anything on Zoom? Yes, sir.
You appear humble, civil, and
I have plenty to be humble about.
we're beaten down pretty hard, and the court came out on your side. And then we've got McCollum coming back in the office. Is there room for you and Virginia or other politics in the future?
Well, there's plenty of room for me, but I
Certainly young compared to
just have good genes. I'm not that young, but thank you. I love 38 years in public service. Most of it driven by my parents. My mom worked for a congressman, a Democratic congressman. My dad was in the military forever and then a civil servant after that. So they taught me those things I was trying to talk to everybody about before. Is just follow the golden rule, be respectful, be nice to me. Man, weren't you all raised that way? I mean, this is not rocket science. I haven't told you anything today you don't know. I'm reminding you of what you know and why we're a great country and why society depends on these basic tenets of success, for success, of humility and civility. That's the way I was raised. And to the degree that we raise our own kids in our own companies like that, but anyway, thank you for saying that. I'm enjoying, I didn't even introduce Michelle Paul. She's an attorney and she's the operations manager for the McDonnell Group and just started. And anyway, she put all this together with John and bought into that terrible First Amendment free speech thing. But I don't think so. I feel like my role now, at least in government, is one. I mean, I'm a regular commentator on Newsmax TV, so I get to give my opinions there about what's going on in the body politic. And I try to be a fair broker as much as I can about both the policies, but also, I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, black, white, brown. If you have poor behavior in office and you don't treat people with respect and you say things that are not accurate and you're always trying to punish your enemies, that's not the kind of leadership we need in either party. So, and I feel that I can speak about those. I'm trying to help mentor young candidates that I can kind of see that they've got the ability to be good statewide or federal leaders. I feel like that's all a good role for me. I'm writing a book about my unpleasantness with the federal government and the spiritual journey that I was on. I think that might be of some help and benefit to people. I think, after 38 years of doing that, I feel like I've done my little part to help make the state a little bit better. And now I can do some other things. Plus, I got 7 grandchildren, so I spend a lot of time loving on them and having them love on me. But anyway, I'm still deeply care about the country. That's maybe a great place to close because I think our time's about done. you know, we are all amazingly blessed, whether you're born here or whether you come here, to truly live in what many would agree is the greatest experiment in democracy the world has ever known. I mean, let that sink in for a minute. I mean, I guess you could put in their time in Greece and Rome and some of the others, but and of course, like I said, they thought the party would never end either. And you know, we're 240 some years into this party, but you know, was it Reagan that said we're only one generation away from tyranny? So we all have a duty to be able to remember, first of all, why are we? Why have we become so prosperous? Why are we arguably the greatest country on earth? Why do we have the highest you know, GDP in the world, although China is going to pass us probably within a decade? Why do we have so much freedom and opportunity here in America that people from all over the world want to come here to this country legally and illegally to be part of what we have? Then we take it for granted. And then when you get those answers, which are pretty self-evident, I think, and a lot of it goes to what our founders did with all their wars, with all their horrific understandings about slavery that they perpetrated, and many of them on slaves. With all of that, why did they somehow have the wisdom to put in place a writing in the Declaration and the Constitution that have ushered in more freedom and liberty and opportunity than any other country the world's ever known? I mean, these are things that we then jump ahead 240 years till today and say, of course, we need to change some things to be more just and more equitable and more fair, and to use the capitalist system to spread the wealth around more equally, to provide more entrepreneurships for people of color. I mean, all those things we should be about, but don't, because we got some problems, don't chuck the fundamental tenets of America that have led us to this point and restructure it based on lines of either socialism or some other system of government that has been a proven failure for 150 years. I mean, that's, again, a little bit of my partisan philosophy maybe coming out, but I think it's something that bears reflection. You know, we're also the most generous country on earth. Just Google Nations Generosity Index and you'll come up with America at the top of almost every list. There's a few we fall into 5 or 6, but that's one of the cardinal virtues of a country that's founded on the Judeo-Christian ethic, is this principle of the golden rule and giving unto others. We do that better than any country on earth. I think that's what makes us a great country. That's what Tocqueville said in Democracy in America. It was this kindness and gentleness and civility and generosity to other people, golden rule kind of living that's what's made us a great country. And that was, you know, it's been 150 years, I think, since he wrote that book. So I think these are things that are worthy of reflecting on. And then based on that, just everybody go forth, be a good neighbor. Don't tolerate bullying and unkindness and disrespect to one another's. Let's hold President Biden accountable for that beautiful message he gave his staff. And, you know, we'll continue the greatness of the country. Thank you.
All right, well, that concludes our presentation today. Thanks for everybody who attended on Zoom. Thanks to everybody who attended in person. Governor, what an excellent talk, and thank you for agreeing to come today. A few announcements. Our next speakers series is on February 24th. We'll have a candidates forum between the two people running for the Democratic nomination for Commonwealth's Attorney, Ramin Fadahi and Megan Spison. So thanks for everybody for coming out today. Governor, thank you.